So Brian joins me once again, and in this conversation, we're going to walk through the steps that we need to take to go from accountability to true agency in overcoming a struggle with pornography, but in a much larger way to really understand how these principles can help our mental health and really lead us to a life that's really worth living. If you're like me, you know your mind can be your best or your worst friend. Our mind is an amazing tool that can do incredible things, but our mind can also create problems out of nowhere. Sometimes our mind keeps recommending the same solutions to problems even when they aren't working. I see this pattern play out as individuals try to overcome their anxiety, depression, or even struggles with pornography, using approaches that make sense but aren't very helpful. This podcast will show you how real researchers and clinicians are changing the way we approach mental health and reveal helpful research-supported principles designed to help real people with real problems. My name is Dr. Cameron Staley, and welcome to the Life After Series Radio. Well, I'm back with Brian, and we've had enough of these conversations that I'm not even going to set the stage. I'm going to turn it over to Brian, and I have no idea what he has up his sleeve, but I'm sure it'll be good. So this is your show, Brian.
Oh boy. If it crashes and burns, I'm here for it. Okay, so I've actually been thinking a lot in the past week specifically, and before that, about agency and accountability. And I remember we had a discussion about it a little bit, and like some really cool concepts came out of it, like connection versus confession. I remember that one being very powerful, but I'm more interested in it as just like a life principle. And yes, that applies to struggling with pornography or anxiety or anything. But let's see if I can set the stage and explain kind of my frame of mind right here. I live in a college town. I mean, I guess if I don't share my address, no one's going to come and like egg my house or my apartment, but I live in Provo, Utah. And so I attend Brigham Young, or I am surrounded by students who go to Brigham Young University. And it's a very competitive environment, and there's a lot of pressure on doing good on your homework assignments, your tests, being in clubs, building your resume to be this just pristine individual. And there's so much pressure around it. And I know personally, when I was in school, it was very hard to have those expectations there and even think about meeting those. And so there was a ton of pressure, and I've noticed a pattern in a lot of the people I've associated with and become friends with. And it's this attitude of accountability of, hey, I'm working on this. I'm studying super hard. I'm going to report to you next week on my goals. And I want to do this, 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 and this. And it's so different for me because I'm on the very opposite side of the spectrum. And I very much like blazed my own path. And so I'm not really accountable to anyone. I don't have any teachers. Like, the work I do is my work. And as an entrepreneur and starting businesses, it's on me. And so I'm so curious if it's like a personality thing, because I realized like some people are employees and they're naturally accountable to like your boss because you have to get things done. And so, sorry, there's so many thoughts running around. Does any of that make sense?
It does. And yeah, I'm so curious about this concept for you and where you fit or where this evolved. Because I'd say often people that have struggled with pornography, gravitate to more accountability. And another way I think about that is external sources of control, where if I report to a friend about how much I viewed or how much I studied or if I exercised this week or maintained my diet, if I have to report to somebody else and be accountable, then something outside of me is maintaining that behavior. It's an external kind of mechanism. And what you're describing is, as an entrepreneur, it's like I've kind of shunned that and I'm doing my own thing. This is very much internally driven, that this is intrinsic motivation, that it's about you meeting your own goals and creating your own vision. It's a very intrinsic, internally motivated way to do it. And that's often what I've seen is folks that struggle with porn tend to be more externally motivated. And what you're telling me is you're more internally motivated. And so now I have lots of questions like, how did this work? Because typically that's not what I see with people that struggle with porn.
Is that a personality difference or is that environmental? Or I feel like, why am I this way? You know, like
Yeah. Oh, goodness. So I don't know the best way to call it. I think about that there are different ways to orient to the world. And sometimes the terms we've used in psychology is locus of control. So some people have an internal locus of control, some people have an external locus of control, and it is a really broad way to orient to the world. So with an internal locus of control, that is kind of saying that if you're successful, that's based on your work and your drive, and if you fail at these business opportunities, it's kind of on you. An external locus of control would say, well, if I'm successful, it's because people gave me opportunities and things just kind of happened. And if you fail, it's like, well, it just didn't pan out. There's nothing I can do about it. It's really outside of my control. And so often what I see is there are many people who are religious that develop more of an external locus of control, where for some people their religion can be very internal, and I'd sometimes even call it more spiritually driven, because spirituality feels a lot more internal to me. But sometimes religions, they actually give you the external framework to say, this is what we mean by religious worship. It is praying at this frequency and reading scriptures for this duration. It's these types of responsibilities within your church organization. And so a lot of people appreciate having a structure to help you kind of guide your religious identity, because religion and spirituality can be quite abstract and can rely a lot on faith. So in some ways, it's quite comforting to have an external structure telling you you're in the right direction. And yet, internally, figuring out your relationship with God and your own worthiness, or what is righteousness for you, that is such an internal process, but it's often quite vague. And for me, agency is about that internal process. But I think as humans, our mind likes something that we can frame and put on the wall, and things we can check off and say we've completed. And I've seen that folks that tend to struggle more with porn gravitate more towards that external focus, where it's like, if I could get the right filter or the right accountability partner, this will be taken care of. But if I leave this up to me and look internally about my own decisions and agency and emotions, that seems intimidating. So often I see that pattern. That's why I'm so curious about your thoughts on that and how you relate to that or not.
I think it was one step deeper for me. It wasn't like, if I can't find the right filter, it's the filter's fault. It's my fault for not finding the right filter,
Wow.
because that was on me. And that's my decision. And I, man, this is going deep. I At some point I just realized that if I wanted to make something happen and I worked at it, and it was revolving around like working out, for instance. Like I was a I'm still super skinny, but like I was like 6 foot and like 135 pounds in like my sophomore year of high school. And then I saw this ad and I was like, that guy's huge. I want to be muscular. And then I decided to eat a sandwich and go to the gym. And I realized that like by my decisions, I could change, I could change something. Like my work became a result. And I think that changed a lot of my mindset towards things. But it was always so frustrating because with pornography, it's not, the more work you put into it, it's like the worse it gets, right? And so I remember actually like challenging myself, like if I like messed up and viewed sexual imagery or something, like I would have to like work harder in the gym, or I'd go like twice that day as like a punishment.
Whoa.
But I just find that so fascinating because in my mind it was my work, and if the result wasn't the desired result, it was my work. It was
all on you.
Me to blame. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, so it sounds like all the responsibility, maybe more responsibility than is optimal, kind of sat on your shoulders.
Well, if you want to get stronger, you got to put some weight on your shoulders, right? So
Yeah.
it's probably a bad example. That's so interesting. I just, why is that?
Well, it just makes me wonder, thinking about if we call this an internal locus of control or external locus of control, there's not really a right or wrong way, but I'd say being extreme one way or the other might have some consequences. And I think having some flexibility where if you have this ultra internal locus of control where any successes or failures, it's all on you and other people can't do anything to help you with this. I mean, that could be crippling in a way, very paralyzing, where it's like, I can't get out of this. I don't know the way. I'm kind of stuck. And same thing, having a very extreme external locus of control where, hey, I'm not able to manage these urges. Other people need to figure out how to do it for me. My partners do, my accountability buddies, my filters, my programs. And if those external things don't work, then I'm also lost. And so I think maybe relying either way on those extremes is probably going to be unhelpful in the end. And I think finding a balance, and I think this is what I appreciate about acceptance and commitment therapy, is in the end, it's a behavioral approach. And its roots are in behavioral theory. And behaviorism comes back to this idea that we are responding to contingencies in our environment, that we're going to continue to do things that are reinforced, and we're going to stop doing things that are punished. And that seems really simple, and it is simple for like rats and pigeons and dogs. Like they can learn new reinforcement schedules and change their behavior, and they can figure out how many times they need to push that little lever to get the pellet, and then we change that reinforcement schedule and say, well, you just have to push it sometime in the next 10 minutes, and they can learn a new contingency. And you can keep switching the rules and contingencies. They will keep learning and adapting because they're really good at behaviorism. Humans, we're not. And I think what makes us different is we have this frontal lobe that has evolved to allow us to have language where we can tell ourselves stories and explain why things aren't working anymore. And what I appreciate about ACT is it's actually trying to make us better behaviorists again, where we can get out of our mind and out of these stories and back into what is actually working or not. So like in your example, you shared maybe a story you told yourself is, if I can't do this on my own, I need to punish myself by going to the gym more, and that should work. And that is more of a story that we tell ourselves than an actual contingency in the environment that has anything to do with sexual urges. And it doesn't at all. It's not like a lever you need to figure out the right combination to push, and if you do, then you'll control urges. Instead, it's just a story your mind generated. Like, I've got to figure out a way to make these levers work. Instead of actually learning what the levers are, our mind tells stories about the levers. And that's where we get stuck, is in the stories that we tell ourselves.
I've never identified with a rat. So no, I love it. How you mentioned the language plays a huge part in that, in our ability to, I don't think is the right word, but it's a very human think. Um, but are emotions a big part of that too? Or is it the language that influences our emotions that then influences our behavior?
Oh, if you could answer that, then you would probably have a lot of money and be smarter than me. So we've been trying to figure out the order of that. Is it thoughts that prompt emotions or emotions that prompt thoughts? Which of those engage behaviors? And I would say it's probably not a linear process. Those are probably co-occurring and influencing each other in so many layered ways that we really can't put a formula where thought leads to emotion leads to behavior. I mean, that would be really nice. And I think we've attempted to do that in the past, but I just think it's more complex than that. And the more I'm learning about the nervous system, I'm even questioning what I know about emotions, that emotions might be thinking interpretations of nervous system responses to cues in our environment. And that's a newer thought for me where I'm like, I don't even know about that. So maybe I'll table that for now. So I'm still trying to I'm even questioning what emotions are. Yeah, but that's a whole different line of thought. But I think about this thinking part is we've actually looked at this where they've created what they call Skinner boxes. So B.F. Skinner was one of the early behavioral psychologists that was learning that rats and pigeons can learn different schedules of reinforcement by pushing levers to get food pellets, and then the experimenter could change the schedule, and the rat would learn just after a few trials what the new schedule reinforcement was, and they keep getting their pellets. And so they made a human-sized one for humans to go in there, and a human would go in there and learn their first schedule and push the lever enough times to get their little reward. And then the experimenter would change the schedule of reinforcement, and that human would keep pushing the lever but wouldn't get a reward. And so instead of learning like something changed, how can I learn what the new schedule is? The person would just leave the human Skinner box and go tell the experimenter, something's broken, it's not working anymore. And so they would just tell themselves a story that it must be broken. That's why I'm not getting the same result anymore. I'll go tell somebody it's broken so they can fix it so I can get back to my reward. And it's like we do that because we can think and tell stories. And rats just learn a new schedule and get their pellet. And so ACT really, what one of the things it's trying to do is help us understand how active our mind is in storytelling. And it tells us all kinds of things that should work, like an accountability buddy should work, or punishing yourself by exercising more at the gym should work. And those are really just stories. They're actually not based on true contingencies in your environment. They're really maintaining this behavior.
So it seems like the rats, to pull intrinsic and extrinsic in it again, the human side of that is blaming the system, whereas the rats realize it's them needing to learn. Is that intrinsic and extrinsic?
Oh yeah, this is the tricky part. So, we're really looking from a behavioral model that it is externally controlled, that it's the environment that's dictating our behavior, and we're learning from the environment to navigate it better. But we're not making an assumption that there's a lot of thinking going on at that rat. it is responding to that environment and these contingencies, because getting that food pellet, I guess that is satisfying this internal hunger drive. So I guess you could say that's intrinsic, that's meaningful, but they're responding to these external demands. And that might be a little bit different than humans, that we have this view that there are more intrinsic things like values that can drive us, where we might not say the same thing about animals. And maybe pet lovers might argue with me here, and feel free to argue. Like your dog might have a value to be the best friend in your life and just take care of you. Like that might be possible. But I think what might separate us is, as humans, we are responding to external contingencies. The problem is, with the stories we tell ourselves, we're not even aware of what they are. And then another way to look at this, another way to maybe guide our behavior that isn't necessarily these basic behavioral principles, is that we can have values. They can become our own internal contingencies that are really just driven and shaped by us. And they're not based on external levers in our environment.
So to some extent, we need to have intrinsic responses to extrinsic circumstances. Like my values are intrinsic and rooted within me, and I need to be able to use those to navigate this external system or contingency.
I think so. I think that's well said. And often where people start is, I want to stop viewing pornography because I was told it is bad, or that it will lead to sexual performance problems or destroy relationships or make me unworthy. For me, those are all external motivators, and maybe not actual contingencies that might shape your behavior. If anything, those kind of messages are probably going to ramp up fear or shame. And those emotions are actually maintaining your behavior. But I think the challenge is, for many people, we're unaware of those emotions. And for me, those emotions are the reinforcement contingencies that we're looking for. We're like, oh, we don't want to feel those things. We'll keep responding to these external messages that are often fear-based. And maybe if I'm scared enough, I'll change my behavior. But really, being afraid and concerned that you might not have the future that you want, or be rejected by your religious community or by God, that can be quite terrifying. And there's a very basic part of our nervous system that we share, that rats share, that says, if there's a threat to your survival, get away from it. Somehow you need to feel better and mitigate that. And so for many people with pornography, viewing sexual images and masturbating does help them feel better. And so that pattern repeats, where I feel scared, I feel ashamed. Viewing sexual images is the thing that helps me feel better. Those are the contingencies. But we're not aware of that at all, because often people that struggle with porn are less aware of their emotions and are instead responding to these stories that we've heard and stories from other people. And I think why ACT works so well is that it is a mindfulness-based approach. It says we're going to start to understand your thinking and those messages and start to listen to, what are those emotions, which is really, I wouldn't say a sneaky way, but a sophisticated way to say we're going to help you be a better behaviorist. We're actually going to help you respond to the true contingencies that are managing your behavior. And it's not finding the right filter or accountability buddy. It's actually identifying, what are you feeling? Because these emotions are actually communicating to you what is in your environment. And when we ignore those, we're not even aware of those contingencies. And so when we are lonely, it's telling us that, we need connection. But if we try to mute that by looking at pornography to feel better, we're missing that really vital information. It's trying to help you navigate your environment and figure out what lever you need to push. And we just keep ignoring those prompts. And they're not really a lever prompting us. It is coming from our emotions, and our emotions are in tune with the environment. So when we are afraid or are lonely or overwhelmed, there's a part of us, and it's probably that nervous system level, that is aware of the contingencies in our environment. And all we need to do is listen to that. But instead, our mind tells us stories about it and takes us away from actually listening to what we need to hear to successfully direct our behavior in a way that's consistent with our values.
Wow. There's Psych 101 for you. I've got so many questions. Because for me, and thinking specifically about the example of pornography, it's those external stories that you tell yourself are most of the time conflicting with your internal values. And that's what ramps up that fear, right?
Yep.
Because that's so personal to you and so much a part of like your being that, like we said, it's like the volcano of emotion versus the fire, right? And heightening the intensity of those emotions is always going to make things worse. So then, okay, that makes sense. Sorry, I'm having to like process all this new.
No, this is good. And I think if I jump back in again, what you're describing is dissonance between your values and what's important and what these messages are trying to convince you who you are. And it's that dissonance, there's a discrepancy there that we can't quite figure out, where it's like, I don't want to look at sexual images. I want to focus on maybe wholesome things or relationships or spirituality or, serving other people, whatever it is. And the thought that I'm looking at naked people having sex, that seems so inconsistent with your values and who you are, that it's creating this dissonance. And so our mind scrabbles to make sense of that, where it's like, these puzzle pieces do not fit. Therefore, I will fabricate a story to explain this because it doesn't make any sense. And then the bigger the story that we get, the farther removed we get from our emotions, and the more we bury these values. And we get lost in this story that we're an addict or dangerous or a horrible person or not worthy anymore. And we lose sight of our values and who we truly are and what our intentions really are. And we just get lost in this language, thought, thinking story that's really not based on reality. And I think that's where people they get lost in that story for years and years. And then when they come back to themselves, like you said, and truly recover, where it's like, whoa, I am remembering who I am and what I really want to do. And these stories I've been telling myself isn't really me. When you get back there, that struggle with pornography starts to dissolve. And like, you might still have urges to view, and your mind might still recommend that because it's a coping strategy you've used. But the power becomes much less when you return to who you are and you're clear on your values and you're listening to those emotions. You're back being a good little rat, like responding to true contingencies in your environment.
So that's literally just our mind trying to solve the problem. And these huge stories come out of it.
That's what it does.
Oh, that is so frustrating.
It is so frustrating. And I think we talked a bit about addiction last time we chatted. And addiction for me is more of a story in an effort to solve a problem. And if I tried to simplify pornography in just behavioral economic terms, is sexual images are just a reinforcer. They're just a little pellet. Just like food is a reinforcer and money is a reinforcer, they're just reinforcers. And so as humans, we're interested in gathering reinforcers. Food, sex, those are reinforcers. That is all they are. And so what happens is we have moral beliefs about certain reinforcers that, if you really love money, then it means you're greedy. That must be bad. Let's try to manage that somehow by creating all these myths around that. But also the same thing, if you really are interested in sex, that must be really wrong or maybe pathological or maybe a disease. Oh, let's call it an addiction. And let's create a whole narrative around people that are interested in the sex pellet. It's like, no, it can't just be a reinforcer. We're more sophisticated than an animal that responds to reinforcers. And we are in some ways, in other ways we're not. Like, we respond to food, we respond to sex. Those are really basic drives that just are. And then we put these moral kind of stories on it to say, well, if you are interested in sex, that's immoral, that's wrong, that's deviant, that must be an addiction. And now here's what you need to do to solve that addiction. And it's just this framework and story we've kind of created. And in the end, sexual images are just a reinforcer. They're just a food pellet. But that's not like amazing. It's so simple where our mind rejects that. It's like, no, I'm not a little rat. Like, there's got to be more to this story. There's got to be bigger reasons why I'm struggling. And it's like, no, just food and drugs and sex are just really powerful immediate reinforcers. They're just really strong. That's it. But the thought that, really, I'm just responding to a reinforcer? Nah, there's got to be more to it. And it's like, no. I think the more we simplify it, the more we can have control of our behavior. And the more we complicate it by these sophisticated steps and programs and stories, and like addiction has this own kind of belief system at this point, I think that the less we're in touch with our environment, and the more I hear people say that are kind of in this addiction area, they say, no, like, this is an addiction. I am not able to manage my behavior, and it's been here my whole life. And often the more you believe it's an addiction, the more you struggle with it. And it kind of reinforces that story that it must be an addiction because I'm not able to navigate it. And I've seen when people exit that addiction story, they are able to navigate this fairly well. It takes some time and practice, but it's manageable. And it becomes more manageable when you kind of turn that story back into the library and move on with your life.
You just said something really interesting when you said addiction can be reinforcing. Does that mean that those stories that our minds tell ourselves are also reinforcers?
Yes, absolutely. Our minds are so creative. Or if it's like, I'm looking at pornography and I don't want to, why is that? It must be because it's an addiction. Oh yeah, that helps me feel better. And now if I keep viewing and I'm not able to, it's even more evidence that it's an addiction. And so our minds do that. They're always looking for information that confirms our belief. That's the confirmation bias that we have, and why in our nation there's so much division around politics. And we only search for information that confirms what we already believe. And that's why, oh my goodness, politics is such a mess. And why social media is such a mess. We only follow people that agree with us, and we distance ourselves from people that have a different view. And it's just confirmation bias. And our mind does the same thing with stories, is we only accept information that is consistent with the story we're telling ourselves. Everything else we reject. That is what our mind does. And I think about a good little behaviorist, a good little rat, isn't doing that. It's actually listening to what is working and what isn't. But our mind is more interested in maintaining this story. And that story is addicting, if we could use that term.
It sounds so simple, but it's like the most grand applicable topic.
Yeah.
And you just threw out a few little food pellets of wisdom right there that we could go off. Because, like, first off, politics, but also like social media and like how that is confirmation bias. I hadn't thought of that before.
Yeah.
And like following people that you agree with. And I was going through like, oh yeah, like I don't really follow anyone who like challenges my beliefs. That'd
Yeah.
be a cool exercise though.
And I'm guilty of it too. And I try to repent of that and actually intentionally look at news sources from political groups I don't agree with, because I want to challenge myself. And as a scientist, that's what we do, is we're actually not trying to prove our theories. We're trying to challenge them and look for the flaws. And I think about, if I think about behaviorism, it's another word for that is learning. And I think about learning only occurs when we're confronted with new information or information that's inconsistent with our current beliefs. That's learning. So if we continue to read things that reinforce what we already believe, that's not even learning. And so learning occurs when a little rat learns a new schedule of reinforcement and adapts. It's confronted with a new situation and it figures it out and it adapts. That is learning. And many times we can go weeks and months and years without really learning. We're only bringing in information that's consistent with what we already think. And that isn't learning. And so what we're trying to do with mindfulness is to get back to learning. So instead of like, oh, I viewed porn, I got to confess that, I got to report that to my accountability buddy, shame on me, let's bury that and move forward. That prevents any opportunity to learn. And so what we want to do is slow down and be like, oh, actually, like, what were the thoughts? What were the emotions? You know, what was going on in your environment? Maybe you stayed up late studying for an exam, you were sleep deprived, you hadn't eaten. Yeah, that made you more susceptible to managing these impulses or urges. Let's learn about these contingencies. And we might need to start viewing this problem in a different way. And that's super challenging because your mind's going to reject it and say, no, I got a good story going on. I don't need an editor. I don't need revisions. I'm just going to keep writing. But learning only occurs when you're confronted with new information that might be different than what you've already been taught.
So when those new contingencies, is that the right way to say that?
Yeah.
Come, it's agency that allows us to learn, and accountability that seems like a big statement to make, that it would be accountability holding us back and agency helping us learn.
Yeah, and I don't know, because I'd say there's a place for accountability and there's a place for structure. And then I think about, if we go back to religious terms, we've both enjoyed kind of studying the Bible and learning about some groups. And the Pharisees in the New Testament is in a group that's so intriguing to me, where they developed this external structure that to help them be more religious, but that external structure became their religion. And they kind of lost sight of the religious values and that desire to connect with God. It was more about maintaining adherence to the structure. So I think structure is helpful. I think accountability is helpful to a point. I think it's scaffolding that can guide us. And I think when I'm wanting to build a new building, I want some scaffolding. You know, I want some people that know what they're doing, and I want some frames. I want to be able to rely on some things as I'm building something that's new. But then at some point, we want to take the scaffolding away and make sure, hopefully, we built on a solid foundation and had good construction principles, and this can weather the storm. And if not, then yeah, let's take some parts off and try again. And we might need some scaffolding and some external support here and there to do it. But I think what happens is some people say, yeah, I want to keep the scaffolding up forever. And I don't want to exercise because I want to be healthier. I want to make sure that somebody is making me do it all of the time. And I think having like a workout buddy is helpful to get you started. And I think going to church with a buddy is helpful to get you in the door. And maybe having some study buddies is helpful to learn some good habits. I think that's the beginning stage. But then if you keep doing it when you're starting to grow beyond that, it's actually keeping you stuck. And that's when I see it becomes problematic, that scaffolding and external reinforcers and accountability is not bad. I think it's helpful to initiate something new. But ultimately, once you get some momentum and you've started to build things and create things, that agency and that freedom, I mean, there's a whole world in front of you, and that scaffolding is just keeping you stuck.
That resonates really well. I like that. And I think maybe it's just my pride that is like no accountability, right? Like even when you're building it, you got to like scale the walls yourself, no scaffolding, like, but that's going to lead to a lot of weak walls. And
Yep.
so I like how there is a place for both, but agency ultimately is the end goal.
I think so. And I think about my own health habits, and I have a value of being physically fit and healthy. And one way that helped me get started is I had a buddy that we'd work out in my garage together. And then when I moved and didn't have that friend, I quit exercising. And it's like, oh no, like my value is still there, but my ability to follow through on that really dropped. And so I tried to find a new buddy, and we went exercising a couple times, but that guy, I wasn't as close to him, and I quit exercising. And I even had a home gym. I had equipment in my house that I didn't touch for months at a time because I was relying on this external kind of motivator. And at some point I recognized, if I want to do this on my own, I need to maybe start a little bit smaller instead of having this whole workout routine that's going to be an hour long. That's too much for me to start. Maybe I'll start by just doing some push-ups before I go to bed, or maybe doing some sit-ups when I wake up. And that counts as my exercise. And I started doing that internally, but starting a lot smaller. And I didn't need a buddy to say, let's do some sit-ups together. It was really me starting where I was capable in that moment. And then as I was able to feel good about that, I'm like, I exercised today for like 30 seconds. That helped me get some momentum. And now I'm exercising fairly consistently, lifting weights for an hour several times a week. And I don't need a buddy to do it. But I had to find a good entry point, a good starting point that was helpful. And so I think it is learning. I was learning about what kind of support I needed from people and what kind of drive I needed from myself. And that's been a trial and error over a number of years, and it's learning. And then when I have kids, I got to learn new contingencies because now my timing is different, or I start a new job, I got new responsibilities. That this continues to evolve. And so like when my exercise routine stops, instead of me saying, you're a lazy piece of crap, it's like, oh, I wonder what changed. What are the current contingencies that are making this unworkable? Let me understand that, and how can I adjust? And that might be scaling my exercise back or bringing in a buddy again at some point to help me get back on track. But I need to listen and be like, something's different. What is going on? How can I learn the new contingency so I can be consistent with my value of being healthy and fit?
I remember when we first started doing these podcasts, I would always say stuff like, we're talking about this new concept, but I feel like I've learned that before. We've been talking about acceptance and commitment therapy for months now. And I feel like I'm just seeing it in this like new light of acceptance can turn those baby steps of accountability into learning and into agency. And that's such a cool part of it, because it is those, like even when you're first starting in the Life After program of like module 1 and you're going through all those shovels, and it's the baby steps of understanding and accepting that, and then moving up the ladder, pun intended, and getting to the point where you are an agent and you do have control because you're mindful. That's a really, it's like ACT in a nutshell, right?
Yeah. I think
That's
you got
so
it.
cool.
Yeah, LAP, those 10 modules, they're just a structure. They're just scaffolding to get you started. But there's a reason why I only have 10 of them instead of 52 of them or 200 of them. Is at some point you need to start listening to yourself and responding to contingencies in your own life and situation. And there's not just a book you can read to teach you that. Is you need to cultivate some skills, and they are awareness and mindfulness and values and engaging in things that you really care about. And those are the principles that are going to take you far. And so LAP is designed to help get people started, but it's not the end. It's the beginning. And I think about therapy the very same way, that Sometimes people come in and say, oh, I'm feeling so much better. Like, I want to meet with a therapist for the rest of my life. And I'm like, no, that's not what I would want for you. That some people may need mental health counseling for longer than others. But for me, the goal is to give you the support and scaffolding you need to ultimately be your own therapist, to understand what you need emotionally, relationally, for your own health, be able to validate yourself, listen to yourself, navigate these in your relationships. And I want that therapist to go away. That's an external thing that I want to go away. And I want that to become internalized at some point. That's my hope, is I do want to become irrelevant in people's lives in that therapy capacity, but I need to be there. And sometimes I provide a lot of scaffolding and a lot of support. And then I am working to taking that back as quickly as I can to help people learn to grow on their own and trust themselves. And I think a lot about this life that gets difficult is we don't trust ourselves. We're like, no, I'm going to lean on a therapist, or I'll lean on this addiction program, or I'll lean on pornography or other people. But in the end, I think the only way really is to trust yourself and recognize that you are creating this life. You are writing your story. And at times we do need support. We need people. We are social creatures. But in the end, you're writing your story. It does come back to that. There's no way to escape it.
I've always loved that about Lab. I love that it's a self-help program that wants to help you so you don't need it.
Yes.
And that, I hope everyone can understand that principle. There's a reason we move out when we're 18.
Yeah.
You don't, like, when you're 45 and living with your parents, like, social stereotypes got it right. That's not really that cool. Like, and that might be a terrible example for lots of other circumstances, but it's the point of, like, being an agent for yourself.
Yeah.
And writing your own story. And at some point you got to take the leap or make the jump or dive in, or whatever the imagery is. But that's why I love LAP, because, again, being in the addiction recovery program and people having been there every week for 40 years, nothing frightened me more.
Yeah.
And if I knew nothing else about LAP other than it was a program that wanted me to get it over with and never do it again, or just continually use it, but without that rigorous, just the structure, that's all I would need to know.
Yeah. Yeah, that's neat. And I think it's challenging because our mind prefers structure. It prefers safety. We want that freedom, but part of us maybe wants to be that 40-year-old in the basement because it feels a little bit safer. And I think there's times in life where we have to return home and we need that support because life throws us some legitimate hardships. And I'd say it's okay to lean on that structure at times, but I'd say don't get comfortable there. Like, the goal is to recover, maybe heal from some wounds, get back on your feet and try it again. And I think that's the beauty of life I'm so growth oriented, where as soon as I'm comfortable, I'm like, okay, next thing, let's push ourselves.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's okay to sit there and be like, oh, I actually made it somewhere. Let me enjoy this moment and appreciate where I am and appreciate this view. And so I think there is a balance there. So I think staying in comfort or staying in growth is probably not ideal, but finding a balance of, it's okay to enjoy where I'm at and it's okay to challenge myself. But that growth is learning, and that's where that improvement comes. And it really is living. I don't know another way to live. And I still tell myself stories, and I'm getting better at recognizing the stories I tell myself that are not based on real contingencies. But I tell myself stories about relationships and, well, they hurt my feelings, and that's why I'm going to do this and not interact with them anymore. And those are stories. Those are assumptions that I make that keep me stuck. And they're not necessarily consistent with my values or who I want to be. And sometimes I'm like, yeah, I'm going to sit in that story for a little while. And I recognize it is a story that I'm telling myself. And hopefully I don't stay in that story. And I'm thinking about some relationships in my life that I probably need to improve and work on. And I need to get started. But I'm really comfortable in the stories that I tell myself. And I justify my actions and my position. And that is so human. And that's okay. But I think it's important to recognize that we're doing that and being intentional that, yeah, I'm choosing to tell myself a story and sit here and do nothing. Okay. How long do you want to stay there? Like, set a time limit, an expiration date, and then get back to work, living your life. But I think that's so human.
I agree. And I regret, I can't wait to be sent this clip when I'm 45 and living in my parents' house because something happened. I know, I'm calling it right now. Like, but no, I very much appreciate that perspective. And I love that, like, no matter what, it's okay. Like, if you are leaning on the structure, it's all right. That's part of acceptance and commitment therapy. You're out doing your thing and life is rolling over you and then reversing back over you and driving over you again. That's all right too. Like,
Yeah.
it's all of that is on one side of the spectrum of learning.
Yep.
And that's kind of the main principle there.
And that's what I've learned about life is we might be doing really well in a really good flow, and then life changes the contingencies on us and things get hard and we start to feel depressed or we start to feel anxious or we start to have conflict in our relationships. And often I find that people struggle more with mental health concerns or seek out counseling during a transition where they're either leaving home or starting a new career or getting married or having children, or there's an illness or a sickness or they're moving. And these transitions are really disruptive because the contingencies are new and they're different. And we don't know how to respond to those. We're operating off these old scripts. And so often I do see people struggling more with things like anxiety or depression or pornography concerns during a transition in their life because we're just not that aware that a contingency changed. And it might be as simple as like, oh, I moved out and I'm so excited to start college. This is great. And everybody's happy for me. We had a party. This is exactly what I want. Why am I struggling so much? Why am I depressed? Why am I anxious? Why am I missing home? And then we tell ourselves a story like, you have no reason to be upset or struggling. But it's like, well, the reality is most of your contingencies have completely changed abruptly overnight. And school still might be something you really want to do and are excited about, but everything just changed in your world and we're just not that aware of it. We're like, no, these are things we celebrate. The same thing with like getting married. Like, I still laugh with my partner about this. I was so excited to get married and I loved our first year of marriage. My partner really struggled, probably because she was married to me, but because contingencies changed on her and she missed her family and she missed her home and she missed her routine. And I didn't understand that. It's like, this is what we want. Don't you want this? And it's like, yes. And everything is completely different. And that's an adjustment. So even things that we like and things that are good are still difficult. And I think our mind rejects that and says a story that says, no, that can't be. Like, your life is good. You have no reason to struggle with porn or feel depressed or be anxious. And for me, that's just a story that is not consistent on what's really going on in your life. And life is hard and it's constantly evolving. And if we're not attending to that, we do struggle with mental health and compulsive behaviors. And then we readjust and figure out the contingencies, and then life changes them again. Like, this is an ongoing thing. And often why people come to counseling at several different points in their life, because there are many different major transitions in our life where we have to slow down, learn some new contingencies, dust off some old skills that we've forgotten about, learn some new ones that we need. And this is like a forever process. So this is why I think about there's so much more than when someone says, I just want to never look at porn again and solve that. And it's like, oh no. Like, life is way more complex than that. It is constantly shifting and evolving. And as it shifts and evolves, your mind's going to revert to an old coping strategy to say, things are different. Like, go look at porn to feel better. And if we just focus on like, I can't have that in my life anymore, we're going to neglect the real challenges and contingencies that are maintaining that behavior. And it's a lifelong process. But I think the more you're aware of that, the less you're thrown by these changes and the more you can start to predict and prepare for some adjustments and be more open to say, yeah, I'm super excited to have a new baby and I'm not going to get as much sleep and I'm going to have less freedom and it's going to be really scary and tough. And we can be more realistic about these wonderful things in life that also come with a shift in contingencies that are quite challenging. And then I think the whole narrative around mental health would change, where it's like, of course we struggle with mental health concerns at times. Life is difficult and our brain is not really equipped for shifting these contingencies so rapidly. We actually need some help to do that. We need some support. And sometimes we do need to live with our folks again. And sometimes we do need counseling. Sometimes we do need the 10 modules of LAP. And then hopefully as we start to be more aware and learn, we'll be able to adjust quicker, but there's still an adjustment period. That just doesn't go away.
That's so true. I just want to applaud the human race. Between all the babies that are born every day, between all the new jobs, all the kids leaving for school, all the military personnel, a shifting contingency, there's got to be thousands every second. And the fact that we're doing as good as we are, I think that's a straight up miracle. And granted, there's room for improvement, but I think, I mean, you just diagnosed however many people there are in the world. At some point, that includes just about all of us, the shifting contingency. I think even being aware of that, and I've had people in my life tell me, okay, now you're comfortable, or you're a little more comfortable in your new environment as you've moved away, but prepare for that next phase of when you move again and you start working. And I have part of that is a little bit fear-based because it's like, oh gosh, I remember how scary it was and how terrible it was moving away for school. And do I really want to do that again? But it goes back to that learning opportunity.
Yeah. I like how you think about that, like with those new moves and transitions. And it's like we get used to, okay, we made this one work. And I got in that trap where I moved successfully several times early in my marriage, just with school changes and internships and jobs. And then we made another move and it didn't work. And it threw me because like new moves always work. We always adjust. What's wrong with this one? And I wasn't able to respond to those contingencies. And so I think every time we do a new move, they're different. We never step in that same stream twice. It's always new water, a new season. And we're like, no, I've stepped in streams before. I should be good to go. It's like it's always different. The temperature is always different. You're always different. It's always different. And I think one of the things that is also interesting is going backwards. Where like you said, oh, I've moved away from home. I've adjusted. I've acclimated. Sometimes when we go back home, those old contingencies show up. And I've seen people say, you know, I've gone away, I've learned some new skills. I'm not struggling with pornography as much anymore. I don't feel as depressed. And then when I go home, I struggle with pornography more. I don't know what it is, being around my family, being in my hometown, or I start to feel depressed again. I'm having conflict with my family and my friends, but I don't even want to do that anymore. Like I've matured and have better coping strategies. And some of that is that old environment is that powerful. Those old contingencies are still in place. And I think about that too when I hang out with my family. I still interact with my sister as we did when we were children, even though that was decades ago. And it's like just being in the same environment brings up old contingencies. It's like, I don't want to behave like that. I don't want to feel like a child. That's the power of these contingencies. They are influencing our behavior even when we don't want it. And that's why sometimes we're like so excited to see family for Thanksgiving and Christmas. And we can struggle in those holidays too. And we can feel sad and we can struggle with porn in those moments that we want to be like, no, but I'm doing better now. And these are good things. Those old contingencies still show up. We just can't escape those.
That makes so much sense. I know one of the questions I've asked before, is like, why are holidays so hard?
Yeah.
And especially just hearing other people's struggles. It seems like the majority of the people show up for like the addiction recovery program, like right around like the Thanksgiving, Christmas time. And I always thought that was so interesting, but with those old contingencies, it makes sense. And like those classic, like high school friends that always stick together and never seem to do anything but go to parties and keep living the high school dream life.
Yep.
Like that you get in those like behavioral ruts. That makes a lot of sense.
I like that. That's maybe a more user-friendly term. It's behavioral ruts, and we revert to that, and then we get frustrated with ourselves, where it's like, we've moved past this, and we're older now. I've got my own family. Why do I still react this way? Why do I still feel like a child, and my parents are telling me what to do?
Right.
And that just really is how we operate. We're still influenced by these contingencies. I think the more we're aware of it, the more we can articulate that to other people, and the more we can talk ourselves through it. And we're not beholden by those contingencies. They don't need to control our behavior, but if we're not aware of them, they absolutely have the potential to.
I love that. I love this because I ordered lap thinking it was going to solve the pornography problem, right? It was like a shovel for me. And instead they just brought like the whole lottery winning. It's just like, yeah, pornography, whatever. But like, here's a better life.
Yep.
That's the way to do it.
I love it too. Yeah, for me, the idea of the medical model of our goal is just to get rid of symptoms and then people are healthy. For me, I'm like, no, there's a better way. Like, instead of focusing on getting rid of symptoms, we can focus on well-being and actualizing yourself and living a life worth meaning. And for me, that's way more exciting than get rid of porn. It's like, no, there's so much more. And ACT is one way to open that, and not the only way. And that's what I like about ACT is, if ACT isn't working for you, don't tell yourself a story that ACT should work for me. That's just another story. Like, if it's not working, set it down and find something else. Like, that's okay. ACT is not the we got to make it work or else, because then that's just our mind doing its thing. We really need to listen to what is working and what isn't. And sometimes ACT is not helpful for some people based on their situation. And so as a clinician who appreciates ACT and sees the world through an ACT lens, being aware that I'm not going to do some acty stuff right now is actually still doing ACT. It's just being aware of what's workable and what isn't. And for me, ACT doesn't own that, but it's very consistent with ACT.
And that resonates with me as the right way to, well, I guess I was just doing ACT there too, because it's figuring out what works and implementing it. There it is.
Yep. Yeah, even though I do a lot of ACT and really appreciate ACT, I don't do ACT therapy with the majority of the people I work with in therapy. I don't. But when it comes to compulsive behaviors and anxiety concerns and OCD and perfectionism, I find ACT to be quite helpful. But when I'm navigating trauma or depression or relationship concerns, ACT probably would be helpful, but I find other things that fit me a little bit better, that are still workable. I don't need to do these ACT concepts. And so the flexibility really is the key. And when we become more in contact with our environment and the contingencies in front of us, we're more flexible to respond to those demands. And that flexibility is how ACT defines mental health. It's being psychologically flexible, which means you're in tune to your environment and responding to the actual demands. So the inverse of that would be psychological inflexibility, where you're responding to stories in your head and you're not aware of your environment and what's going on. And that is where suffering comes from and mental health disorder comes from. And so really, instead of getting rid of mental health disorders, we're really trying to improve people's psychological flexibility, or their ability to be in tune with themselves and the environment. And that is a way to conceptualize good mental health.
And I apologize because I just need to voice this. Thinking holistically and tying it to like a physical side of things, you think of someone who's inflexible, a lot of like muscular imbalances, lack of mobility, and like high at risk for injury. And the opposite of that, when you are flexible, extremely mobile, you don't feel tight, you're relaxed, your shoulders sit, you don't have pains because of those imbalances.
Yep.
Like, I'm sorry, everything resonates. It just fits in multiple fields.
Oh, I love that. That's a great comparison. As you say that, I get this visual of water, like crashing against the rocks, or when it gets heated, it turns to steam. Like water is so flexible. Like you can't really break water. It just moves around things. Like you could take a sword to it or hit it with a hammer. It doesn't break. It just moves around what's in front of it. And it even changes states if it needs to continue to navigate its environment. It's so flexible. Like if you throw a block of wood against a sharp sword or against the rocks, it's going to just get destroyed, get pulverized. It's not flexible. It's not going to respond to that. And I think we're trying to become more like the water that is fluid, that can respond to what is needed in this moment. And I kind of like that as well, because we're mostly water. And so we have that potential to be fluid and flexible. And then our mind is often what makes us rigid and creates these barriers and turns us into a 2x4 that isn't flexible. But I think that is the goal, physically for our health, but also psychologically. And ACT is very clear in that kind of the conceptualization is mental health disorders come from psychological inflexibility. That's the theory. And it really goes as simple as that. And to treat psychological disorders, we want to improve psychological flexibility. And there might be different ways we do that for different people, but that is good mental health. And so if we're struggling with a mental health disorder, there might be evidence that there's some inflexibility in some area of your life that is contributing to that. And we want to understand that better and promote more flexibility, which for me is exciting, where it's like all this is workable and we can be better in the end. But if we are hurting and suffering, there might be some areas where we need to limber up a little bit and learn some new skills and some new stretches and figure out what we're sitting on that's causing some pain. And as we do that, there is a path forward that we can heal from these things and feel better.
What better way to live?
Yep.
Amen. I feel like the last like 20 minutes just turned into this like commercial, but it's when it works at such a deep internal level. I don't know, as someone who has been extremely inflexible and now seeing the drastic change that it is to be more flexible and how many different aspects of life that improves and benefits, I just wish I could have had it sooner.
Yeah. And so maybe this is where it ties in, is we began this and you mentioned you're more internally driven. And that sounds like that's true of you, but there was also some inflexibility in that way. And there's some people that are more externally driven, but also inflexible. And both of those are going to lead to some challenges. And so the thought of you being this internally motivated person, like you're going to go far. Like, I don't worry about you, Brian. I don't stay up at night like, oh, I hope Brian's going to be okay. Like, you're going to be successful in your life, in your career, probably careers and your relationships. And then thinking about you being like, yeah, and sometimes I need to be more flexible, less perfectionistic, more flexible about what is going on and what my abilities are and where I am in my life. For me, is like, yeah, that's it. Being able to adjust is going to be the key. And so that helps me understand where it's not necessarily internal locus of control or external locus of control that might lead to a pornography problem. It's more about that inflexibility, that rigidity of thought, and that kind of allegiance to these stories we tell ourselves. That's inflexibility. And so you could be external or internal locus of control But it's really that inflexibility that gets us stuck. And that sounds like that was really the thing that shifted for you when you let go of that control agenda and focus more on, what do I need? And I need to listen to myself. And you're still internally driven. That hasn't changed for you, but you're a lot more flexible now.
Because that inflexibility it wasn't just a symptom, right? That's the core.
Yep.
The core issue.
Yep. You got it. Well, this is fun. Thanks for leading us out and setting the stage for thinking about agency and accountability. Like, sometimes I think about, I am a psychologist, but a lot of psychology is fairly philosophical. And in the end, I'm offering behavioral treatments and cognitive treatments and mindfulness approaches. But there is an existential philosophical component to a lot of this that I don't think, if we just stayed in philosophizing about these things, that doesn't change behavior. But I think having a framework and kind of taking a step back and understanding the bigger picture is really helpful to then get back to the business of living. And that is actual behavior and actual action. But sometimes we need to let's pause a little bit. Let's learn about our environment, figure out all the things that are going on. And sometimes these more philosophical conversations can be helpful for that.
I love them. And this is like education at its finest. I love learning like this and conversations like this.
Okay. Well, till next time, my friend.
All right. Thank you.
See you, Brian.
Later.
Hey, thanks for listening. Please remember to rate and subscribe. I know you might be facing some issues in your life or know someone who is. Issues like anxiety, challenges in dealing with emotions, or other compulsive behaviors like unwanted pornography. And I know it's tough to talk to people about problems. Difficult to stare those obstacles down that we face in life and to really know how to deal with them. It's hard to know what to say and when to say it. And then when that moment you finally reach out to family and friends happens, sometimes it falls flat. I haven't found many programs teaching effective strategies like mindfulness, how to improve relationships, and ways to address unwanted pornography viewing through research-supported principles. So whether you simply want to help with a problem like unwanted pornography, difficulty responding to emotions, or just want to understand the world of someone struggling with porn a little better, head over to LifeAfterPornography.com and get in on the next training. There you'll learn the exact same strategies individuals addicted to pornography used to transform their lives by implementing principles from evidence-based treatment shown effective in research for reducing unwanted pornography viewing. You'll learn the secrets, the myths, the enemies to recovery, and the LAP framework for dealing with unwanted porn viewing that we call WAVE. If that's something that interests you, click the link in the description or just head over to lifeafterpornography.com. I'm Dr. Cameron Staley. See you on the inside.